And these three questions, I find them to be so powerful. And so this is the sort of insightful conversation that we need to have. No, in theory, that we should stick with the problem space before we jump into the solution. But in practice, in the corporate world, it's really hard to do. Start with, what do we want to do? And the solution space. There is this temptation to start with the solution space. And why is that? Why is that? Because questions in the unknown makes us deeply uncomfortable. One format that I'm talking about in this next book that I'm working on is, the following three questions to have those insightful conversations. Because everything that we work on in the corporate world or in our lives, we can think of those as puzzles. Puzzles that we've set, and then puzzles that we're solving through various decisions. And so as you're solving a puzzle, we ask three questions. So the first question is, how well did it work? So whatever you attempted, being able to invite the good and the bad. So rather than just setting a goal or a target that asks the question, have you or haven't you achieved this number, right? I'm inviting both the good and the bad when I ask, how well did it work? The second question is, what did we learn? This is where I say to teams, yes, I do want you to share numbers, but I don't just want the numbers. Don't just tell me, here's the sales pipeline, the number of leads generated, blah, blah. Or, if it's about product, don't just tell me user engagement rates, returning user rates, blah, blah, blah. It's not just that. I want to know, what have you learned? What is actually happening? And then comes the third question. What will you do next? So meaning, if I gave you a magic wand based on how well it worked and what you've learned, what would you ask for? Right? And these three questions, I find them to be so powerful. And so this is the sort of insightful conversation that we need to have. And I'll give an example, right? So we might be looking at an engineering or a product problem. Let's say the problem was, we were observing that only tech savvy people were using our platform. And we wanted to make the product a lot simpler so that tech-averse people will use it too. Now you try something. Maybe you tried automation. This is all a real example that I've been working through with a company. This was what happened. So we thought, maybe we can add automation, right? And that will make things so much simpler for the tech-averse users. They're going to love it. So we tried that. So now let's ask these three questions. How well did it work? It turned out that people liked the workflow we were showing, but they hated the automation. Second question, what did we learn from this? If we only looked at user engagement rates, the returning customer rates, etc., it would have told us a partial story. But we had to understand it better and figure out the narrative in our heads, what's happening. And here's what we figured out after observation, etc. We found that they liked the workflow, but the automation, they did not trust it. In tech-averse people, it felt like magic. And tech-averse people hated magic. They did not trust technology enough to trust the magic. So this is why it wasn't working. So the third question, what will we try next? Based on this, we realized, okay, we are going to build a workflow, but instead of creating automation that does all of these steps for you, we will guide you through every single step and let you very systematically decide so that you feel in control, so that for tech-averse people, they know exactly and can predict exactly what's happening next. And so this is how we can set a vision, plan our actions by balancing vision against survival, and then we can evaluate all of our decisions by asking three questions. How well did it work? What have we learned? What will we try next?
This is a nice additional level of detail to what I call the simplest possible process, which is, what do you want to do? Well, let's do that. What did we learn? What does that suggest to do next? And that what did we learn phase is where explodes into your 3 questions to give additional guidance when the answer isn't clear or when there's dissension over what we learned. Then we can drop down to this additional level of detail of the questions that you bring and see if we can get clarity there. If there's still dissension about what's going on, what to do next, then there's always another level of detail that we can drop into in one of those 3 questions and keep going until we get down to what the actual point that we're disagreeing on is. Make that visible, then we can have that conversation and bubble back up and see where else we might have disagreements on. And eventually we can get all of that worked out and get up to a consensus on, okay, this is what we'll do next.
I love that. And I think, to add to what you said, right? I think having this level of clarity so that you can get into more detail is helpful, but the starting point can be one where we're asking questions. What you said, right? You were saying, well, what do we want to do? And then trying it. This is one thing that I find happens often in the corporate world. We start with, what do we want to do? And the solution space. There is this temptation to start with the solution space. And why is that? Why is that? Because questions and the unknown makes us deeply uncomfortable. So even if you look at lean startup, right? Lean startup is often summarized as build, test, learn, scale, because we want to start with a building. Let's build something, then we'll test it, figure out what we learned and scale. But if you look at what the book actually talks about, it does talk about identifying the problem first and looking at the problem space. But whether you look at lean startup, you talk to UX researchers, we all know in theory that we should stick with the problem space before we jump into the solution. But in practice, in the corporate world, it's really hard to do. And this is one of the challenges when you have goals and targets.